Hello. So this is the talk that I want to give, distinguishing Islamophobia from reasonable criticism. And I am Tariq Modood from the University of Bristol. It was not very long ago that Anglophone scholars of racism understood it in terms of biology, and specifically in terms of the black-white binary. At the same time, other scholars, especially in continental Europe, understood racism in terms of anti-Semitism, especially in the recent biologized forms that Europe has manifested. When it began to be clear that these two paradigms were failing to capture some contemporary experiences, such as anti-Asian cultural racism in Britain or anti-Arab cultural racism in France, some scholars began to move away from these paradigms. Yet, following the assertive Muslim agency triggered off by the Satanic Verses affair and other Muslim controversies, as Muslims responded to such hostilities and articulated their misrecognition, they were constantly told that there's no such thing as anti-Muslim racism, because Muslims are a religious group and not a race. Hence, Muslims could legitimately ask for toleration and religious pluralism, but not for inclusion in anti-racist egalitarian analyses and initiatives. While this view continues to be expressed even today, and some deny that there is a racism that could be labeled Islamophobia, it no longer has the hegemony it once had. While a number of Anglophone authors, including myself, started using the concept of Islamophobia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was the Runnymede Trust, with its 1997 report, Islamophobia, A Challenge to Us All, which launched the career of the term as a concept of public discourse in Britain and much beyond it. It presented Islamophobia as, I quote, a useful shorthand way of referring to dread or fear of Islam, and therefore to fear or dislike of all or most Muslims, end of quote. While the report was groundbreaking and played a crucial role in getting people to think about anti-Muslim prejudice, I felt it did not sufficiently locate Islamophobia as a racism, like, say, anti-Semitism. I continued to write about Islamophobia as a form of cultural racism, which may be built on racism based on physical appearance, for example, cultural racism, but was a form of racism in its own right, like anti-Semitism. This also became the approach of UNESCO, and I'm pleased to see that it has been explicitly embraced by the new Runnymede Trust report of November 2017. It is at the center of the definition offered by the 2018 report of the All-Parliamentary Group on British Muslims that seems to have been accepted by everyone except the government and its supporters. Islamophobia is a form of cultural racism because while the perception and treatment of Muslims clearly has a religious and cultural dimension, it equally clearly bears a physical appearance or ancestral component. For while it is true that Muslim is not a biological category in the way that Black or South Asian or Chinese is, neither was Jew. In that instance, it took a long, non-linear history of racialization to turn an ethno-religious group into a race. More precisely, the latter did not so much replace the former, but superimposed itself, because even though no one denied that Jews were a religious community with a distinctive language or languages, culture or cultures, and religion, Jews still came to be seen as a race, and with horrific consequences. Similarly, Bosnian Muslims were ethnically cleansed because they came to be identified as a racial group, that is to say, as having a perceived line of descent by people who actually were phenotypically, linguistically, and culturally the same as themselves. The ethnic cleanser, unlike an inquisitor, wasted no time in finding out what people believed, if and how they went to a mosque, and so on. Their victims were racially identified as Muslims in terms of community membership, based on a perceived line of descent. Race, then, as I understand it, is not just about biology or even color. For while racialization has to pick on some features of a people related to physical appearance and ancestry, otherwise racism cannot be distinguished from other forms of groupism, it need only be a marker. So the physical characteristic like color may only be a marker. This is illustrated in the conceptualization of cultural racism as what I have called a two-step process. While biological racism is the antipathy, exclusion, and unequal treatment of people on the basis of their physical appearance or other imputed physical differences, for example, their non-whiteness, cultural racism builds on biological racism a further discourse which evokes cultural differences from an alleged British or civilized norm to vilify, marginalize, or demand cultural assimilation from groups who may also suffer a biological racism. As white people's interactions with non-white individuals increased, they did not become necessarily less conscious of group differences, but they were far more likely to ascribe group differences to upbringing, customs, forms of socialization, and self-identity than to biological heredity. Cultures and cultural practices are usually internally diverse, containing and omitting various, what we might call authentic elements, and adaptations and mixes. So to racially group all Jews or Muslims together as one cultural race or as one ethno-religious entity, it follows that the culturalized targeting is expansive, is broad, rather than purist, aiming to catch most, if not all, cultural minorities in that targeted group. For example, a non-religious Muslim might still be targeted as a cultural Muslim or Muslim by community, which of course means Muslim by background, which means birth and ancestry. Hence my point that Muslims, no less than Jews, are identified racially and not simply in terms of religious beliefs or behavior. Moreover, if we accept that racism does not necessarily involve attributing qualities which inhere in a deterministic law-like way in all members of a group, then we do not have to rule out cultural racism as an example of racism. As such, we should guard against the characterization of racism as a form of biological determinism, which leaves little space to conceive the ways in which cultural racism draws upon physical appearance as one marker amongst others. The next set of remarks are called danger of reducing Muslims to Islamophobia. While understanding some contemporary treatment of Muslims and aspects of their societal status in terms of racialization clearly is an advance, we should beware that the conceptualization of Muslims in the West is not reduced to racialization or any other othering theoretical frame, such as Orientalism. By definition, othering sees a minority in terms of how a dominant group negatively and stereotypically imagines that minority as something other, as inferior or threatening, and to be excluded. Indeed, the dominant group typically projects its own fears and anxieties onto the minority. The danger of reducing Muslims to racialized identities is particularly high at the moment because the Islamophobic othering of Muslims is acute and, if anything, rising. Minorities, however, are never merely projections of dominant groups, but have their own subjectivity and agency through which they challenge how they are perceived or misperceived and seek to not be defined by others, but to supplant negative and exclusionary stereotypes with positive and prideful identities. Oppressive misrecognitions thus sociologically imply and politically demand recognition. Our analyses, therefore, should be framed in terms of a struggle for recognition, the recognition of one's own identity, so like the recognition of Muslim identity. Recognition, of course, does not mean thinking of Muslims as a group with uniform attributes or a single mindset, all having the same view on religion, personal morality, politics, the international world order, and so on. Muslims are just like any other group. They cannot be understood in terms of a single essence. Groups do not have discrete nor indeed fixed boundaries, as these boundaries may vary across time and place, across social contexts, and will be the subject of social construction and social change. And Muslims are no different in this respect. This, what's often called anti-essentialism, is rightly deployed in the study of Islamophobia and Muslims. It is a powerful way of handling ascriptive discourses, of showing that various popular or dominant ideas about Muslims, just as in the case of, say, women, gays, and so on, are not true as such, but are aspects of socially constructed images that have been made to stick onto those groups of people because the ascribers are more powerful than the ascribed. Anti-essentialism is an intellectually compelling idea and a powerful resource in the cause of equality. So I now turn to the final set of remarks, which is captured in the title, as I said. Islamophobia can be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Islam and Muslims. Because it may be asked, what about reasonable criticism of Muslims and Islam? How are we to distinguish reasonable criticism from Islamophobia? Take this proposition that I would like to put up on the screen. Excuse me. There we go, this proposition. Muslim views about women are oppressive and not appropriate for modern Britain. So the question is this Islamophobia or reasonable criticism? My suggestion is that we should apply the following 5 tests. Firstly, does it stereotype Muslims by assuming they all think the same? Does the criticism seem to suggest that all or most Muslims have this blameworthy characteristic and that this feature defines Muslims, indeed drowns out any worthy characteristics and ignores contextual factors? Second test, is it about Muslims or a dialogue with Muslims which they would wish to join in? Does the mode of criticism consist of generalizing about a group in a way that tends to exclude them rather than treat them as conversational partners who share common concerns? Thirdly, is mutual learning possible? For example, one may criticize some Muslims for sexual conservatism or Puritanism, but is one willing to listen to those Muslims who think that contemporary societies like Britain are over-sexualized and encourage sexually predatory and undignified behavior? And I've got a couple of examples here. I think in the post-Harvey Weinstein and Me Too climate, it might be easier to understand the point here about mutual learning than it might have been a few years ago. Also, the respect that a lot of Muslim cultures have for older women relative to the kind of culture we have in Britain or in large parts of the West and so on. And issues around schooling, for instance. I won't go into the details of these examples. Let's turn to the fourth test. Is the language civil and contextually appropriate? Is the behavior or practice being criticized in an offensive way and seems to make Muslims the target rather than stick to the issue? I think a good analogy here is how reasonable contextual criticism of Zionism can become a diatribe against Jewish people as such, and therefore can become anti-Semitic. So similarly, criticism of Muslims, if it is not civil and contextually appropriate, can also turn into, morph into, grow into Islamophobia. But just as criticism of Zionism is possible and important without it becoming anti-Semitic, so similarly, criticism of Muslims can be appropriate and important. Fifthly, and lastly, insincere criticism for ulterior motives. Does the person doing the criticism really care about the issue? Or are they using it to attack Muslims? I think, for instance, some feminism and gay rights arguments, perspectives, have been used by people who are not that committed to those positions, but think, this is a good stick to beat Muslims with. This is a good weapon against Muslims, so I'll adopt it as my own position. Because look at the changes in British society. 25, 30 years ago, a lot of people thought that issues of homosexuality, practice of homosexuality, was not appropriate to British society, or certainly was just a marginal feature of British society. Now we're told, often by the same people, if we're thinking about, for instance, newspapers like the Daily Mail or the Sun, we're told, respect for homosexuality and alternative sexualities is actually at the heart of what being British is. And if you're not able to do this, as some Muslims say they're not, and of course some other conservative religious people, then, well, you're not really British. You are, we're right to be suspicious of you. So those are my 5 tests. If the answer to questions 1, 2, and 5 is a yes, or there's a no to 3 and 5, then we may be dealing with Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. Any discourse can, of course, have a mixed character, but the more the answer aligns with the pattern mentioned, the more that discourse needs to be examined closely as to its potentially Islamophobic character. This, of course, is not a litmus test with a single decisive color result, like a litmus test. I hope, however, it indicates what we should be looking for and why, and so can be the basis for a discussion about whether a particular discourse is Islamophobic or is reasonable criticism. So I hope that this talk is useful to you in this Islam Awareness Month. Thank you.